time that Bernie Sanders started running for president. It was back in 2015. And I was doing everything I could to try to get on that campaign. And I was volunteering, I was using my coding skills. And someone I knew told me, you got to talk to Zack Exley. He's on the campaign, right? So I got on the phone with Zack and we just talked for hours and hours and really hit it off. And Zack ended up bringing me onto a campaign. He was running this incredible team that was organizing, the millions of volunteers that were not in the early 4 states. And so that was really how our collaboration began. And it was really fun, and working with Zack, I've ended up working with him for the last decade now, I guess. It seems really crazy to say that now. But, we just really saw eye to eye on a lot of stuff. And I'd say we matched on values, right? Like a lot of where this is coming from is Zack and I, we both really feel like it's actually possible to do these big things in the country if we can organize and get people together to do it, and we really do have to do it. That's the only way to defeat the kind of authoritarianism we have right now. But yeah, Zack, I don't know if you've got a different take on it.
No, yeah, I'd say the same thing. I've been doing this, I've really been into policy and economics and trying to figure out how to build a new economy for my whole life. But also, I've been an organizer on campaigns. And I was a computer kid, going way back to the 80s. And so when the internet came along, I started using, trying to figure out how to use the internet to organize and mobilize people. And that wound up leading me to work for moveon.org, which some of your listeners of a certain age will remember getting emails from me when I was there. And but the thing we did there that was really special is we had a developer. There were no products back then. This was like the early zeros, right? There were no products to send out mass emails and like organize events and all that kind of stuff. So we had to build it all ourselves. And we had this amazing programmer named Patrick Kane, who, has since gone on to build like a big software platform that lots of organizations use that came out of MoveOn. And after that experience, like whenever I worked on a campaign, I was always so frustrated with the products that we had because we couldn't improvise and do new stuff, come up with new ways of bringing people together. Sometimes we were able to do it here and there when we found a really good developer to help out in some way. But on Bernie, I was responsible for organizing that whole national grassroots organizing thing. And so I was asking around, and like Saikat said, somebody introduced us, and I was like, Saikat says, yeah, I worked in tech for a little bit, but he's being very modest. He was the one of the founding engineers that built Stripe. And so coming with that introduction, I knew that this was, no ordinary developer. This was somebody with like serious engineering skills who could build big stuff. But I always say that I was really scared because when working on previous presidential campaigns, sometimes you get these people coming out from Silicon Valley and, they don't want to do any work. And they built some big thing in Silicon Valley and they're friends with the candidate. And so they come in and they're like, oh, you people are idiots. If only we had real, talented tech people like we have in Silicon Valley, we could do this all different. And then they leave, without touching anything, without doing anything. And Saikat was the exact opposite. He came and he sat down and he was like, what can I do for you? What do you need? And he went out and did the organizing. He actually organized along with us and saw what kinds of tools we needed and built them and was just constantly innovating and improving. We didn't have to worry about it. Everything just got better and better because he was using the tools that we were using. And that's the best way for software to be built. So yeah, it was a great collaboration. But then we did realize that in addition to being into this organizing stuff, that we both really clicked on policy and on dreams of really changing the world and really building a whole new clean economy. And so we actually started New Consensus together, as well as starting brand new Congress, which became Justice Democrats. And I guess the rest was history, or is still playing out as history.
Yeah, when Justice Democrats were founded, when we had the Green New Deal rolled out, for a lot of people like myself, that was like a beacon of light during some really dark times during the first Trump term. Now you fast forward to 2025, and you have the Mission for America out. And Saikat, as I mentioned on the podcast before, you're running for Congress, you're running for in the primary for Nancy Pelosi's seat. There are going to be a lot of people around the country, around the world, that are looking for the kind of beacon of light that they found with the Green New Deal. And you can see I was incredibly impressed and surprised reading through the Mission for America. I guess in this time where there's no power in Congress that's going to pass massive climate legislation, that does not mean that this cannot be a kind of renaissance for climate policy. What do you feel like is the unique opportunity that we're living in when it comes to passing real progressive climate policy? Or not, sorry, not passing policy, but developing that policy.
Yeah, I mean, I think the real opportunity right now is sort of the chaos of the political moment we're in. That because ultimately, like if we're stepping back, people keep voting for anybody who's really talking about big sweeping economic change. I think that's why people voted for Barack Obama. I think that's why people voted for Donald Trump, right? And it's really coming from this place of, for a long time, and I know this is diverging from climate a bit, but I think this is really connected. For a long time, for a lot of people, life's been getting harder and harder. Wages have been stagnant for a big majority of people, while the cost of essentials have just been skyrocketing, right? And this is a fundamental thing that's driving this sort of politics where people are open to what the change looks like, but they just know the status quo is just really not cutting it, right? You have to have something different. And so what the larger idea we're trying to push with the Green New Deal was, hey, when we're talking about solving climate change, it's not just about stopping fossil fuel infrastructure or just putting a tax on carbon. We actually have to build this new clean energy economy. And that process of building it is the way we get unstuck. That's the way how we stop this stagnation, this decades-long stagnation, right? And so I think the opportunity, if you can call it that right now, is Donald Trump just got elected saying he's going to rip the Band-Aid off this economy, fix this rigged economic and political system, and get manufacturing back, get wages going up, get costs down, and he's going to fail at all of it. He's going to fail. He's going to make all of it worse, right? So going into 2028, there's a real chance to say that didn't work. So what is the vision for the Democrats and for the other side? How do we make this work? And, people often talk about this as like messaging. It's not messaging. We actually need a real vision and a real plan because we have to win and then we have to deliver. And it's going to be much harder to build a whole economy that improves people's lives than it is to just like go in and destroy the federal government like Donald Trump's doing, right? But that's the real opportunity. And I think it's not going to be, I think the way our politics goes right now, we see huge groups of people shifting from one side to the other, just like on a dime. So it's not this process of like, we need to do decades long organizing to build a movement. No, I think there's really this chance that like we could get a big majority of the country to suddenly give another vision a shot. And that's really where the Mission for America fits in. It's trying to give us we're trying to put out the blueprint and kind of playbook for this is what we could actually do starting on day one, kind of our version of Project 2025 to start building. And it's the kind of, if you read the document, it's a political strategy too. It's like, how does a president and a movement actually, do this building in reality and bring the public along for it so that we actually get the time to do it successfully, right? And keep winning elections off of it, even if we don't have it all built out in 2 years or 4 years.
No, it's fascinating. I did read the document, and it does call in very interesting ways. It calls for leadership and the need for leadership. And what I think is, I'm curious to hear from both of you. We're living in this moment now where we passed the Inflation Reduction Act. This was so critical to the U.S. climate movement. We went nowhere near far enough. There were giveaways to the fossil fuel industry. Nevertheless, it was by far the largest investment in climate we had ever seen in the United States. It made real, meaningful differences. And some of that policy has not been stripped away, but a lot of it has, especially when it comes to the major climate provisions. They've been stripped away. And if you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, what set it apart from other climate policy in the United States was it remained fairly popular, even when it throughout right-wing attacks throughout the legislative process, it remained pretty popular. Yet when it was stripped away, my feel on this is that not that many people are that up in arms outside of, niche progressive corners, climate corners. Not that many people are, not many regular Americans are as upset that those climate provisions have been stripped away. So I'm curious what you think are the political lessons that we can learn about the Inflation Reduction Act both being enacted and being stripped away.
I think actually that like part of what we're trying to do at New Consensus with the Mission for America and what we were trying to do with the Green New Deal is to show people that there's a whole different way for nations to act and for nations to build. And the really like there was a great thing that happened with the Biden administration, and there was a tragic thing that happened with the Biden administration. And the great thing was that a lot of the key policymakers in the administration really started to get this idea that nations can build their economies intentionally. Like it's not a matter of like state run, the government building everything, but it's a matter of like the whole society making a decision that we're going to invest in these industries and we're going to upgrade these industries. And the government has a role to play, business has a role to play, banks have a role to play, and there are institutions that we need that we don't quite have right now, but that a lot of Biden officials like tried to do with things like the DOE loan program office, for example, to fill in some of the missing institutions. So the great thing was that a lot of these people really were understanding what needed to be done. The tragedy was that the administration did not know how to talk about what they were doing. And this was partly on Biden because he was just too old to really talk in an audible way. But and I think maybe, I don't know how much we should blame the policy people because their job was doing policy. I think that a lot of the comms people and like the political people in the administration, it's not really their fault, but like this is new stuff and they didn't know how to talk about it. Right. So you didn't have the whole administration just shouting every day, like, we're investing in these industries that are going to we're building factories in your communities. We're building infrastructure in your communities. These are amazing jobs. And there's so many amazing jobs that are happening now and that were going to happen until Trump cut everything. And so that's why people don't care about what happened to the IRA, because they didn't even know the IRA was happening. And that was just a huge missed opportunity. So we're trying to we're trying to help and do our part to help so that next time that doesn't happen, that the next White House will know how to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, and I think part of it is sort of like, I remember that whole thing about whether or not Biden should sign the COVID checks. Remember how like Trump, when he sent out the COVID checks, he put a signature on it, and then the Biden administration was like, no, that's taking too much credit. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
but you got it, right? Because ultimately, the reason there's no backlash is I bet if you go to a bunch of these communities where these factories are coming up, battery factories are happening in Georgia, all these places where jobs were actually getting built, the people there didn't realize that was the result of Biden doing something very specific. So they're just seeing it as like normal market conditions, whatever, factories come and go. But if we had really made a big deal of it, like, imagine if the IRA moment was kind of happening the same way that like the tariffs are happening right now. No one knows what the tariffs are, but everybody knows Donald Trump is doing tariffs, right? So that's
Right.
you have to get to, that level of breaking through. And that's just something I think they weren't able to accomplish.
And they're still so bad at it. And like, here's like, we could think about what they could be doing right now. Like this, I think it's a Hyundai factory, right? The one that just got shut down by this ice sweep of a bunch of workers. So the whole factory shut down, right? And like, we've got two Democratic senators there, right? We've got a bunch of other Democratic politicians. We've got, leaders in the House. They should all be down there screaming and yelling about that, doing big press conferences and just like talking about it endlessly about how, look, first of all, these jobs were brought by Biden, by the IRA, by the Democrats. And now this crazy policy by Trump has shut it down. All these jobs aren't going to happen. This is going to be thousands and thousands of Georgians, red state voters, that aren't going to be making these big salaries that they were just about to make. But have you seen any Democrat like doing anything on this? I haven't. I don't know. Maybe somebody is somewhere.
The other thing that I think is going to be so critical to watch over the coming years is going to be electricity costs, right? Because as we know, it's not as if repealing the provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act will kill the solar or wind industry, right? It's too late for that. It will slow it down, right? And we've had energy analysts that have come on talking about the big beautiful bill and what it means for the U.S. Electricity grid build out. And what we can arrive at is costs are going up, right? Data centers are popping up all over the United States. We have a greater demand for electricity, but we're not building out electricity quickly enough. So it gets at this question: can progressive politics meet the question of cost head on for everyday Americans through climate solutions? I'm curious, to the mission for America, how you see climate policy actually meeting every American's everyday cost needs.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is like a real failure of, again, trying to message this stuff, because too often, the IRA got framed as just a thing about trying to tackle climate change, as it really was a way to build up high wage jobs and reduce the cost of electricity by building out tons of cheap energy in America, right? Weirdly, in this like bizarro way, Trump campaigns on like energy abundance, right? He's like, we're going to unleash the power of American energy. And then he's cutting everything that creates cheap energy, right? So it should be a layup for Democrats to go in and talk about, this is the vision to create this energy abundant future where, we're thinking of energy like water, right? It's so cheap. It's everywhere. Utility bills are going down, right? We're building transmission lines and we're making everything go down in cost. And a lot of it, and the detail side of it, this is what the Mission for America goes into. A lot of this is about actually just planning, right? And not just planning the grid, because we do some of that in a bunch of the states, but matching that up with planning what we're building. We know we have these shortages of, say, large power transformers. And right now we have no real plan for building up companies that'll build that big bottleneck in our grid planning, right? And as a result, we can't, even if we make a great plan for where our grids should go, we can't execute that plan. There's no way to actually build out our energy infrastructure. I'm using a large term for infrastructure, which is not just our transmission lines and distribution lines, but all the pieces that go into it, the transformers, the electric steel, all that policy, all that needs to be getting built out together so that we are targeting a low cost, what should we be thinking about is like, how do we make sure your utility bills never go above an X amount by making sure this much amount of energy is always available? That's the way we should be thinking about this, right? But yeah, I do think it needs to be, the whole thing needs to be reframed into how Democrats are the party of actually building out this low cost energy. And look at China. Look at what they're doing. They're building out more solar and more nuclear every month than we do in like years, right? And that's why it's cheap. That's why they're able to do everything else that they're able to do. That's why they're kicking our butt in every industry right now.
One of the perverse things about the Trump administration is the way that the big beautiful bill is actually going to create jobs for people through ICE, right? This is like, there doesn't seem to be any lack of political ambition of the state to hire people when it comes to immigration enforcement, right? And this is what you see from the Trump administration. That is not what I want to see personally the state be doing with its resources and what it comes to when it comes to creating jobs. Nevertheless, you're seeing ambition from the right to do almost something closer to what I was hoping to see in like a federal jobs guarantee when it came to like a civilian climate corps or something that's the state would do to build up more jobs to attack the climate crisis. So I don't know in this moment how partisan it is for the federal government to take the initiative to build out a robust workforce and play an active role in that. I guess, like, what have you been, as you've observed this moment, as you mentioned, things can swing from one direction to the other pretty quickly politically. Like, what do you think is politically possible in this moment that may not have even been possible when you were rolling out the Green New Deal?
I mean, it is sort of interesting because Trump does do sort of the Nixon going to China thing pretty often, right? One thing we talked about in the Mission for America is the government taking equity stakes in companies in exchange for money. Trump just did it with Intel, and of course, like he's going to do it in a way that's going to be probably very corrupt and as a kind of a tool of oppression to try to like get his political goals across. But you could also do it in a way that's good for the country, that's generating revenue for the country. And I mean, same thing with tariffs, right? Like we don't. I don't think tariffs are like the solution that'll bring manufacturing back on their own. But should tariffs be a tool we consider? Absolutely, right? And they should be part of our general package for building up manufacturing in this country. And that was, was anathema to the Democratic and Republican Party to talk about tariffs until Trump just went there. But similarly, I hadn't even thought about it that way. It's really smart. But like, yeah, what they're doing with ICE right now is basically a big federal jobs guarantee program for the purpose of policing. Is this, and this is what countries do when they completely start to fail in their economy, because it's so much harder to build your economy than it is to just start, build up a military force or a police force and do destructive acts. And we're kind of just giving people jobs as our last resort to do this, simple work of rounding people up and kicking them out of the country, which is crazy.
Yeah. And you see, and I didn't mean to interrupt, Zach, but you see how unpopular this is. Like, what is happening? How unpopular people do not like the opinion polls on immigration have shifted in really encouraging ways. Nevertheless, if people are going to see their careers tied up in this, like that is to me what is really, really scary. And like to go back to your point, Saikat, on climate policy, like the goal of climate policy is not to get people invested in just solving the climate crisis. It's to solve the inequality crisis, the cost of living crisis, like the everyday pain that people feel that's deeply connected with the climate crisis, but isn't limited to that. And things can swing wildly in this moment. And is like, it's a real hinge point.
Yeah. I mean, something you kind of hear from like armchair historians, is, fascists they're really horrible, but at least they build up their economy. But that's actually not true. Just like we're seeing with the example you're giving with ICE, all the fascist governments with, Germany and Italy in World War II in that era, they did not actually do a good job of building up a good economy. They couldn't, right? And in the end, that's why they go to war, because it's the only way that they have to actually organize people, get people jobs is through this very simplistic mechanism of just like pillaging and pouring money into the military industrial complex and pillaging other countries, right? So you kind of see that with Trump, with everybody around Trump, with Project 2025. Like Saikat mentioned, like Project 2025 was just a plan to cut stuff. If people say, oh, so is Mission for America like Project 2025? We actually started long before Project 2025. And also, it's an entirely different kind of thing. If you read Project 2025, it literally is just a list of things to cut until it gets to fossil fuel subsidies, where it's like, we need to start those back up again and make them even bigger. Like literally, that's all it is, right? And what this is part of, but the problem is that if progressives don't figure out how to do the thing, that sometimes the fascist gets credit for, which is to build a prosperous economy that is in a democratic context, and that's good for everybody. If we don't figure out how to do that, then people are going to keep voting for worse and worse versions of Trump, right? And lots of even worse versions are coming. Like we can already see that, and as hard as that is to imagine, and that's really what we're trying to do with the Mission for America is work out all the details. There's big ideas, there's big concepts, there's big institutions that need to be created, but then there's also just like a million little details of like, regulations that need to be changed, rules that need to be changed, responsibilities that need to be shifted from one agency to another. There's all this stuff that what we've learned over the past, several attempts at Democrats getting in there trying to do big stuff is that these efforts get defeated because of these little details. And because once they're in office, there's no time, for anybody to go around and like figure all that stuff out. So the IRA, like, luckily, like a lot of thinking went into, before anybody even came to the table to start planning the IRA, a lot of thinking had gone into what would we do, and a lot of that stuff got into the IRA. But even with the IRA, there were so many little things that are missing or that are wrong, or responsibilities are in the wrong place. And so, as great as the IRA was, it, like you said, it wasn't going to get us anywhere near what had to happen. And a lot of the just basic ordinary stuff that was planned wasn't going to happen because it was just hung up on various stuff. So that's what we're trying to do, is to fill in all those blanks, so that, and we hope that in the next administration that people will be looking at it. We're going to try to get to them before the rush of the next administration. We hope we can get all the teams of all the various people running for president to take a look at this, take a look at what we're working on, and that may, we hope, form what they do when they get in there. But if they just get in and try to wing it and don't really make huge breakthroughs in building an economy that is good for everybody, that really restores prosperity, then we're just really screwed, because we're going to get, even if Democrats win in 2028, we're going to get a return to MAGA or whatever in 2032.
And one thing I want to just add on to that, because you were talking about how this is getting really unpopular, right? Like Trump doing this, huge deportation campaign with ICE is becoming really unpopular. And I know Democrats, because I was in there for a year. And one conclusion they're going to draw from this is, oh, when we make too much of a show, when we're in the news too much, when we talk too much about something, that's what makes the thing unpopular. This is literally how Democratic messaging brain works. It's, you have a fixed set of political capital, and the more things you do or say, your political capital goes away, right? So you do as little and say as little as possible. And Trump is the complete opposite. He believes that the more you do, the more you say, that's how you convince the population. That's how you build political capital. And, Trump's in the right direction. Is just the things he's doing are incredibly unpopular. So you shouldn't do it. So I would really say, there are examples of leaders and of countries where they take the Trump approach to messaging, but in the service of construction. And I'd say right now, a big example is with Morena in Mexico. They're constantly talking about, this is what we're building. These are the train lines we're building, the hospitals we're building, everything we're doing. And they are the most popular government in the world right now, right? This is what FDR did. He was constantly telling the population, this is what I'm doing. This is how we're building. He's explaining in detail. And he was one of the most popular presidents of all time. So we can't throw out the baby with the bathwater. The Democrats do need to take this approach of talking about what they're doing and making a big show of it. And if you did towards something that's popular, that's constructive, that's building, I do think you could have a very popular Democratic governance in this country for decades.
A lot of energy has come to the Democratic Party through people holding Congress seats that get primaried, right? A lot of climate policy energy has come from members of Congress that won a tough primary against a sitting Democrat. You're trying to do that against Nancy Pelosi. One of the things you will often hear as a huge compliment when it comes to Congresswoman Pelosi is that she has gotten votes. She's been able to move the caucus in a direction. You've talked about marrying political strategy with the policy that you want to see. What do you feel like is your political opportunity if you go to Congress? How will you be able to inspire more Democrats, actual votes, to move in the direction you're talking about?
Well, part of this is going to be, we need new Democrats in there, right? So what I'm talking about doing this time around, even with this campaign, is trying to recruit people to run all around the country. I think we've got to go into 2028 with a whole new cohort. And I think it's necessary, because if you look at the Democratic Party today, they're polling worse than Donald Trump, right? They're polling underwater with Democrats. And that, to me, doesn't get solved unless you have a completely new batch of Democrats who represent what the party is, who change what the party stands for, who change who the party stands for, right? And that's not, we just saw Trump do that with the Republican Party kind of as a lone individual. I don't think we should do it that way with this cult of personality, but I do think it shows that it's possible to do that. So I really think the moment we're in right now the big thing that matters is this sort of battle for the ideas. Because I do think we're like, when I look back at our history, I sort of see us as having gone through these different political eras. We had the New Deal era with FDR going up to Reagan. And in that era, right, like Eisenhower had to govern as a New Deal Republican. And then you had the Reagan era, the neoliberal era, starting with Reagan. And I'd say it really ended with a Great Recession. And during that era, Clinton had to be kind of like a Reagan style Democrat. And since the Great Recession, we keep getting, the population voting for what's next. And I think that's really the thing that matters right now is like, are we going to end up in another 30, 40 years of an era defined by the MAGA authoritarian right, in which Democrats are going to have to define, govern within this context of like, we have to kick out all the immigrants, yada, 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 like that frame? Or do we pitch a new vision? And I think, I agree with you. I think Pelosi has been an excellent tactician in the context of, given a goal to do, she's able to get the caucus together. I don't think she's the person who can actually pitch what the goal should be because of who she is, where she comes from, the number of years she's been in there.
Now, I may be mistaken here. I've not read every candidate's plan for the next Congress, but I don't know that I've seen many Democrats call explicitly for the resurrection of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. So, gentlemen, let's get real nerdy and policy wonk with this, because I think that this is so much, as you state explicitly in the Mission for America, this is so much of what your policy plan hinges on. And this is huge. And this is a resurrection of something. So for our listeners who may not know, including myself before I read this plan, what is the Reconstruction Finance Corporation and what would you like to see it do?
Well, I mean, first, like, let's just back up for 1 second, though, before we talk about the RFC. Let's talk about like what the role the RFC is supposed to fill. And there's this thing that we've really forgotten as a nation, and really the whole world has forgotten this, almost the whole world, is like nations can decide to build new capacities, right? Like, we just saw China, we could take a million different examples from China, right? But China decided, hey, this EV thing is pretty cool. We think the whole world is going to want EVs. Let's build an EV industry. And using a bunch of different institutions and mechanisms, China as a society made their EV industry take off. And now they're the biggest exporter of EVs in the world. And what people don't remember is that China, not very long ago, was way behind the US in EVs. Right. And we had Tesla, we had other companies, we had the big three that were working on EVs, and we were way, way out ahead. But as a society, we said, if EVs are going to take off, let them, whatever. We didn't play a role in trying to boost the EV industry from where it was when China jumped into the race. Now, we should say that the DOE loan program, right, which Obama set up, actually is 100% responsible for Tesla making it as a company, right? And we need to remember that. And the reason I'm saying that, as a society, we didn't make this decision is because like nobody noticed, right? There was no big push, right? It's just that there was this program at the DOE and they said, oh yeah, maybe EVs. And they gave Elon a huge loan with no terms, not taking any equity. Imagine if we had taken an equity stake in Tesla back then for that $500 million loan. But, of course, there was a loan made by the same program to Solyndra, who many of your listeners will know what that was. And that was like the reason why, no, the government should never, and as a society, we should never, step in to make stuff happen. So we except for the loan program office, which is like now shut down, I guess, we really didn't have any institutions to like make big new industries happen. And, so EVs were kind of a fluke thanks to the loan program office. And then we forgot about it. Meanwhile, China was able to see the direction of things in the global auto industry and jump in and make it happen. They have a whole array of state banks, state and city planning institutions, national planning institutions, national banks, local banks, all these different things, right? And it's actually not so super centralized and dictated from the center. But when the signal did come from the center to say, hey, actually, this is the direction we should go in, all of those institutions were able to do their part to send money into the EV industry, into the old state-owned auto companies, but also tons and tons of new startups. There's like 1,000 EV startups in China. And out of 1,000, a whole bunch of them have become really successful and big and are now exporting EVs all over the world. So there's all those different institutions in China, and China's not the only country that can do that. We could tell the same stories about Germany, about South Korea, Japan, France. This isn't like a Chinese communist thing. The problem in the US is we don't have any institutions that with any strength that are worth mentioning that can make stuff like that happen. And in the US, we kind of have this tradition of not building up lots of those institutions. So where the RFC came from back in the Depression was because we didn't have that big network of institutions, we just had to have one big giant one. And so when it came, Roosevelt, it was actually created by Hoover, but then Roosevelt said, "Hey, we need this to get us out of the Depression, and then we still need it to build for World War II." And so we just have this one mega institution that was able to pump the capital in and do all the other things that the RFC does. But it's not like a one weird trick thing, right? Like the RFC isn't some like magic, like weird thing that's going to solve everything. The RFC is just the way of restoring our capacity as a nation to do stuff.
Yeah, and like something important to note about the RFC is it sometimes gets compared to like a public bank because there's been a big public bank push in America, like green banks. But the RFC was really a different kind of institution where it had all kinds of loan and financing capacity, but it had this real mission to go make this stuff happen. So it would go out and figure out, we gave money or we're trying to give money to some industry to pop up. No one's taking the money. Why not? How do we set up, do we go find somebody else, an entrepreneur to do it? If we can't, we set up a state-owned corporation to do it. It's basically like use every means at your disposal to actually make this stuff happen, figure out the bottlenecks, figure out the problems, and solve those problems. And that kind of an institution we really haven't had for a long time.
When I did a great episode. There's a great book by Sandy Vahejian earlier this year talking about looking back at the New Deal, what worked in the New Deal, what didn't work when it came to the New Deal. The fight always, when it comes to people like myself, more on the left, is always going to be like, who gets to decide when it comes to solar and wind, what gets built, where, when does it get built, how does it get built, right? And the fear is, for people like myself, is are we just going to have a massive build out of clean energy that results in privatized gains for the wealthiest people, right? And we see a very unjust transition to clean energy or unjust build out of clean energy, right? And we're talking about things like how do you do that with permitting reform? How do you do that at the state level with autonomy for frontline groups? It's a really difficult situation or a difficult conversation to figure out these things with real solutions. That fight is going to come if you're elected to Congress. So I'm curious from what both of you think of this conversation on how to build out clean energy, but do so in a way that is just.
Yeah, I think my view on it is a lot of this comes from, there's sometimes this tendency, I think, and it comes from this place of we have lost so much state capacity and we've lost so much power at the state level that we have started on the progressive sides, wanting to just create rules and kind of codify like the perfect set of rules that will like make this build out just. But the reality is, like when you actually start doing build outs, it's every situation is kind of different, right? And like the way this happened during the era of the RFC and FDR wasn't necessarily that just like set the exact set of rules. They just empowered the NLRB and they powered workers and they empowered labor, right? And so there was this constant fight going on between workers and the bosses through this build out. And FDR would often take the side of the workers to try to break the strikes, but for the workers, right? But it wasn't like, but it was all made possible because we had this actually capable government that was capable of making decisions and saying, yes, this is the way we're going. Let's go, right? And there was still this overwhelming urgency to do it. I remember talking to this guy who was working in the CHIPS office, like when we were trying to build out semiconductor plants under the CHIPS Act. And he was saying how, yeah, of course, there's all these, labor wanted to have things go a certain way, environmental groups wanted to have things go a certain way, and there's all these interests that were coming into play that were, need to be negotiated with. But it's not like any one of them really slowed down the process of building the fab. The thing that really slowed down the process of building fab is there was no direction on what is the goal, what's the deadline, and which way do we go, right? It's kind of this lack of leadership was the real problem. And I think ultimately I can't give like a one size fits all answer, but I think that's ultimately what we have to do is actually build up our state capacity, make decisions, set a direction, set deadlines, and empower, the marginalized groups and labor along the process so that they're the ones getting the majority of the benefits from this build out.
Zach, anything you want to add to that?
Well, I think, yeah, I think the left, as it should be, is very focused on, let's make sure that, that marginalized communities are taken care of. Let's make sure workers are getting the benefits, and that's how it should be. But if we don't have new industries being created, if we're not upgrading old industries, right, so that we can actually pay people high wages, right, then we're just going to keep declining, right? And so if we're all fighting like for the scraps, right, from the table, and but there's fewer and fewer scraps to fight over, like that's not going to work. And I think a lot of the left would like disagree with that whole formulation, because they're looking at Jeff Bezos and they're looking at Apple and they're looking at Google and they're saying, look, there's so much money, right? Like obviously the problem isn't that there isn't enough wealth. And this is one place where at New Consensus we're really trying to help change the thinking on this, right? Because it's true that the way financial wealth is divided up is insanely unfair and really extreme in this country. And so, there's just more and more zeros in the bank accounts of these big companies and the rich people that started them, right? And the investors. And, but the thing is, we can't actually distribute those zeros. Like even if we, you can't live on zeros in bank accounts, right? Like even if we took all the money in all of those bank accounts and spread it all around to all workers in America, it wouldn't actually really change stuff in the long run. I realize it's kind of a fantastical scenario, but it wouldn't solve our fundamental problems, because what we need an economy where workers are making our living, right? Only when workers are able to go into a place, whether it's an office or a factory, it doesn't have to be manufacturing, but workers need to be necessary in our means of making a living. And that is the only way that they will have a claim on a share of the wealth in this country, right? And if we think that as workers we can be completely useless and just get our UBI, from or get a jobs guarantee, digging ditches somewhere from the ruling class, like I just think that's incredibly naive. We're not going to have the power to do that. And the good news is that actually we have so much work that needs to be done to build a clean economy, and to build an economy, even without thinking about building a clean economy, just to build an economy where people in the US can make their own living. Because right now we've got like $1 trillion trade deficit with the rest of the world. We're just going into more and more debt every year, right? And it's not sustainable. And so whether we're building a clean economy or an economy that can provide good jobs for everybody, or both, like we want to do, like we're proposing, there's so much work that needs to be done to build that economy, and then there will be so much work to run that economy. And if we're building that, then American workers are going to be able to demand insanely high wages. And all they're going to need is the right to organize in order to do that. And that, like Saikat was saying, that's exactly what happened in the World War II era.
And one last thing I want to add to that, just from like the history of the RFC, right? Because when the RFC first started, it was constantly being constrained, and it wasn't being constrained by the left. It was actually being constrained by the financier class and kind of the right in that country. And there was actually, the left part of FDR's administration, people, I think it was Alfred Hirsch, they were constantly pushing for the RFC to have a larger role because they had this view of if the government has more of a say in where the economy is going, then we can do it the correct way, right? And it wasn't really, and so the two end up being combined. Like we kept not being able to get out of the Great Depression because we kept constraining the RFC. Initially it was just backstopping loans from private banks. They start lending to private banks, but there's always this overarching sentiment that we shouldn't have the RFC involved directly in the economy because we're afraid of them picking and choosing winners and all the stuff that you hear about, right? And then finally, in World War II, when there was no option, because we just had to win this war, we had to build this war economy, FDR said, screw it. Let the RFC go. We finally did the thing that the progressives really wanted to do, which was have the RFC directly invest in industries, directly create industries, invest in every part of the economy. And that's what made everything possible. That's what created, this entire industrial base, the entire middle class, this huge amount of wealth that was such broad-based wealth that we basically lived off that for the next 5 to 6 decades, right? And so I really want to paint this picture that like progressives can be on the side of building and wealth creation in a correct way. That's what happened in the New Deal era and in the World War II era.
And it's fascinating because that's exactly one of the biggest conversations that's happening now in all public policy is like defining what abundance is, what it is and what it is not, and who defines that and who advocates it for that. And that's a whole other conversation we could have. We could spend hours on.
Have us back on, yeah.
Every aspect of the mission for America, you could dive. You have so much detail and strategy and very specific areas on steel and hydrogen and buildings. You were talking about EVs, you name it. And I'm overly focused here on the electricity sector just because I think it's political salience. It's always very politically salient. That's only going to increase in the next Congress or over the course of the Trump administration, and if there's a new president after that as well. So I just want to double down here on electricity one more time, because you talk about the possibility of getting to 100% clean electricity in 10 years. That is ambitious and exciting. How would that be possible?
Yeah, it's really not that difficult. We just have to build some stuff. And I know I can hear eyes rolling when I say it's not that difficult because I've had these conversations. Um, and but it's like we just need to build a certain amount of stuff, right? And if you, so yes, it's difficult politically because certain laws need to be passed. And, but that's it. Just some laws need to be passed. And then there's nothing difficult about building out the production capacity that we need to, and the power lines and making the upgrades to the grid and all that stuff. It's low tech stuff, right? It's there's no technology involved that we haven't had for almost 100 years now, right? And so so politically, yes, a few things would need to happen. We need to get a majority of people that actually want to do this, right? In the practical reality right now, that means a Democratic majority. And then all they need to do is get rid of the filibuster, just start ignoring the filibuster, which the Democrats are really on the brink of doing, right? And pass a few laws about how we regulate, power lines and stuff without the filibuster, and just don't let the Republicans block it. And so then all we're talking about doing is building out a bunch of stuff. And we know that it's not that much stuff, because if you look at the scale of building of data centers right now, which is like way more high tech stuff that they need to do, at the scale on which they're building that, right? That is way bigger than what we need to do. The scale, like, think about some of the other achievements that the world economy has had, or that national economies have had just over the past several decades. We put a supercomputer in the pocket of every single human being on Earth. right? We just did that. We did that, and that happened the first time that happened from the first smartphone until everybody had them, well, until pretty much everybody had them, was less than 10 years. This massive global project, to reconfigure our entire, not only our economy, but like the way humans live, right? So, and then if you go back a little further, if you look at how how we first electrified the whole country, how a country like France like built out this giant nuclear power system in a very, very short amount of time in the 1970s, right? If you look at how we built out nuclear power plants all over the country in a very short amount of time, we could have kept building and gotten up to 70 or 80% nuclear power, or 100% if we wanted to, in a very short amount of time. And now we're like, oh, we can't build even one reactor. And there's no cultural problem. It's not that like Americans have like lost their ability to make stuff. It's just that we're not training the kinds of workers we need. We're not providing the financing for the kind of work that we need. And we're letting these stupid little rules and laws like prevent us from, I'm not saying that all regulations and laws are stupid, but there are some stupid ones that are in the way of us just building power lines the way they do all over the world, or building a nuclear power plant the way they do all over the world, or permitting wind and solar plants the way they do all over the world, or the way they do in Texas, right? Like if we just did it like in Texas, everywhere else, we'd be done, So so it's really not that difficult of a thing. It's just some political things that are in the way, and that's why Shoykat's running for Congress.
And it's really, I think, a symbol of whether or not we should give up as a country. It really is. Because I think of the EV build out in China, right? And China, when they started doing their EV build out, their solar, build out, their battery build out, they were in a worse place from a technical standpoint than we are today. They had not as much of like an R&D sector as we do by far. They didn't have like the same kind of industrial base that we do right now. I remember when they started doing their EV build out, everybody I talked to in the EV industry in America was feeling so smug because they're like, they're never going to catch up to us. They just can't have the software engineers like we do in Silicon Valley for some reason, right? And then they started building EVs that are a little better than ours like last year, and everyone's like, wow, well, we can't do that. We're done, let's just give up. Why are we doing that? That's so lame, It's like, if we can't take on a goal like this that's totally accomplishable, we're not even inventing new stuff, it's like way easier than anything we've done in the past that was remarkable. If that is too big for our country to take on, then we might as well give up. And I don't want to give up. I think we absolutely need to be able to take on challenges like that. And that is the test of whether we still have a country that can do things.
I want to just wrap up. Go ahead.
Well, there's another detail about what makes it possible to do this big thing in 10 years, right? Like, we were trying to build, it took us decades to build this, to add this one reactor onto the plant in Georgia, right? I forget what it was called. But, and it's like, oh, if we can't even build this one reactor, like, how can we even consider building like 50 new nuclear power plants across the country? And this might be controversial for some of your listeners still, but at New Consensus, we're definitely in favor of building lots of nuclear power plants. And come read our explanations at newconsensus.com to see why. But but there's this problem if you're trying to build this one reactor, right? Like if that's the only nuclear project in the entire country, then we don't have all the specialized welders and specialized cement pourers, we don't, and all the suppliers, right? We just don't have any of that stuff. We don't have the workers, and we don't have the vendors, to supply some of the stuff that's necessary, because obviously, like with a nuclear power plant, there's a lot of like really advanced specialized stuff. None of it is high tech. We've been doing it for 80 years now, right? But it's but you need people that know how to do this stuff. So China is doing dozens of projects, if not scores or hundreds, and so they have whole industries to serve all of these different needs, and they have thousands and thousands of workers trained up for every category of work who are available. So if we're only trying to do one, it doesn't make sense to build new industries to supply the stuff. So everything needs to be done in a custom way. So this is just one example with nuclear, right? We could go through the same thing when we're talking about doing power lines, when we're talking about, going through the process of approving new power lines, when we're talking about the transformers like Saikat was talking about, our whole grid is on hold because we don't have these insanely low tech transformers and we're not able to produce enough of them. So if we actually had a plan that was being cheered on by the president, that was, being legislated by the Congress, that the whole society was behind, that banks were funding, that our public bank, that the RFC was funding and coordinating. And if we said, we're going to do this in 10 years, then it would make sense to build all of those industries. It would make sense to train all of those workers. And then suddenly we would have the capacity to do this pretty simple thing. So sometimes it's easier to do something bigger and harder than it is to do a bunch of little one-off projects. And that's what we really are arguing, not just for power, but for every different piece of the Mission for America. It's all a 10-year plan to build this whole clean economy for the entire country.
And just to give
yeah.
the counterexample of how China treated their version of that Georgia nuclear reactor. I still remember when China built their first mile of high-speed rail. I think it was connecting Shanghai airport to the city center, and everyone in the Western media made fun of it because it was the most expensive per mile high-speed rail in the world. And at that point, China didn't say, that was too expensive. I guess we can't build out an entire high-speed rail network. No, they just doubled down, right? And it's because they had this long-term plan and they knew they could finance it. And now, of course, they build it cheaper and faster than anybody else in the world, right? So you have to have this long-term planning to be able to create the industries, like Zack was saying.
Yeah, and the planning is important, and that is what we're doing in the Mission for America. And also, I want to do a plug that we're hiring. So it's really hard for us to find researchers who have the right mix of skills, who are also interested in doing this wacky long-term planning, because everybody in their life tells them 10 years, that's impossible. These people you're working for are crazy. So it's really hard. We've got some really amazing researchers, but it's hard for us to find people who have the skills and the talent, who also want to work on something, that certain policy people will mock them for working on, right? But it's just one of those things where, everybody was mocking us when we were developing the Green New Deal. And then when it came out, it turned out to be very cool, something that everybody loved. And that's how it's going to work again with the Mission for America. So get on board now, before it's the biggest, newest, coolest thing. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Saikat, Zack, what a delightful conversation. And again, the thing about the Mission for America that I really enjoyed is you can both, if you go into these details that we're talking about, we just touched on, you can both get the summary and then take real deep dives into the policy and political strategy that you're talking about. So for nerds like myself, it gives you a great gateway into some incredible stuff to review. So thank you so much for putting this together at a critical time and for coming on the show to talk about this at length.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks so much for having us. Yeah.